Welcome back to Swift Tale, the home of stories that remind us how a single moment can change everything. If you're visiting for the first time, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And here's a question for you. Have you ever met someone who seemed invisible to the world, yet turned out to be the reason others are still alive today? Today's story will shake you. It begins not in a boardroom filled with power or a mansion glittering with wealth, but in the quiet echo of a hallway mopped by a man most people never noticed, a janitor named Marcus Reed. Every day, Marcus swept the floors of a billion-dollar tower owned by one of the most powerful men in the city, Alexander Grant, a man who had everything money could buy except humility. To Alexander, people like Marcus didn't matter. They were background noise in his fast-paced world of meetings, deals, and numbers. But fate has a strange way of teaching lessons. One ordinary morning, as the sun lit the mirrored glass of Grant Industries, a voice would rise from the shadows, loud, desperate, and commanding. 5 words shouted with raw urgency, "Don't get in that car." Those words would stop time, rewrite destinies, and expose truths that no one, not even the billionaire himself, could have ever imagined. In the next few minutes, everything Alexander thought he knew about status, success, and power would shatter before his eyes. This isn't just a story about a warning cry. It's about courage in silence, kindness unseen, and the powerful moment when a man the world looked down on became the only one who stood tall. It's about how life can turn in an instant and how one act of instinct can reveal the real measure of a person's worth. So stay tuned till the end, because what happens after Marcus's shout will not only leave a billionaire frozen in disbelief, it'll remind you that heroes are often the ones we walk past every day without noticing. This is the story of the black janitor who yelled, "Don't get in that car," and the billionaire who froze at what he saw. Before that shout echoed through the air, before headlines and camera flashes turned him into a hero, Marcus Reed was just another man trying to survive in a world that often refused to see him. Every morning before dawn, he would lace up the same pair of worn-out work boots, tuck his daughter's picture into his wallet, and whisper a quiet prayer that today would be better than yesterday. The janitor's uniform he wore wasn't just fabric, it was a shield, one that hid both his pain and his pride. Marcus had once dreamed of being an engineer. He was sharp, good with his hands, and fascinated by machines, how each bolt, each wire, each spark came together to make something work. But life, unpredictable and unkind, had other plans. After losing his wife, Vanessa, to a sudden illness, Marcus's dreams dimmed beneath hospital bills and sleepless nights. With no college degree and a young daughter, Amya, to raise alone, he took whatever job he could find, first at a car plant, then at a construction site, and finally at Grant Industries, the corporate tower that gleamed like a monument to wealth he could never touch. To most people in that building, Marcus was invisible. Executives passed him by without eye contact, interns brushed past him in a rush to meetings, and sometimes security guards forgot to greet him altogether. But Marcus never complained. He believed dignity wasn't in what you did, but how you did it. He made sure every hallway shone, every trash bin was empty, every window reflected the morning light perfectly. He took pride in small victories, a freshly waxed floor, a quiet compliment from another worker, or the rare smile from the receptionist who noticed how early he arrived. But beneath the calm exterior, Marcus carried a heavy heart. Amya was growing up fast, smart, curious, and full of hope, but she had begun to ask questions he didn't know how to answer. "Dad," she'd say, "why do people act like you're not there?" He'd smile softly and tell her, "Because some folks can't see past a uniform, baby girl, but one day you'll show them what they missed." Those words weren't just for her, they were his armor against the world's coldness. His evenings were spent in a small 2-room apartment on the south side of the city. Cracked walls, flickering lights, but filled with warmth. The sound of Amya's laughter echoing through those walls was the only wealth Marcus needed. Sometimes, he'd sit by the window, staring at the skyline, that same skyline dominated by Grant Industries, and wonder how many people in those glass offices would notice if he stopped showing up tomorrow. Marcus had seen enough of life to know that being underestimated was both a curse and a quiet blessing. It meant no one expected greatness from him. It meant he could observe, listen, and learn without being noticed. And though he never said it aloud, there was something inside him, a quiet instinct, a spark that always seemed to sense when things were about to go wrong. Maybe it was the military training he never spoke of, or maybe it was just the sharpened intuition of a man who had seen too much struggle to ignore danger. What no one knew, not even Alexander Grant himself, was that Marcus's path and the billionaire's path were about to collide in a way that would shake both their worlds. Because sometimes fate doesn't shout, it whispers through the hum of a janitor's mop, through the rhythm of footsteps on a clean floor, through the quiet eyes of a man the world forgot to notice. And soon that same man, the one everyone walked past, would become the only person who saw what no one else did. While Marcus Reed swept the marble floors of Grant Industries, Alexander Grant stood 42 stories above him, a man the city admired, envied, and feared in equal measure. To the world, Alexander was the face of success, a billionaire tech visionary, the genius who turned a small startup into a global empire. His name appeared in magazines, his quotes in business journals, his presence in rooms where power was traded like currency. But behind the custom suits and the confident smile was a man drowning in silence. Alexander's days began before sunrise, not out of discipline, but restlessness. Every morning he'd stand in front of his penthouse window overlooking the skyline, coffee in hand, convincing himself he was happy. His mansion was a museum of perfection, art on the walls, staff in every corridor, and yet no laughter. His wife, Elena, had grown distant. Their conversations had become transactions, polite exchanges between strangers living under the same roof. His teenage son, Ethan, barely looked up from his phone anymore. To the public, Alexander was untouchable, but at home, he was a ghost. He had built his empire on control, the belief that with enough money and precision, nothing could go wrong. But control has a price. He had fired people for mistakes he'd once made himself. He had crushed competitors without blinking. He had traded compassion for dominance. To him, hierarchy was the natural order of things. People like Marcus existed to serve, not to be seen. When he walked through the building lobby, he didn't even notice the janitor pushing his mop aside to let him pass. To Alexander, it wasn't disrespect. It was simply habit, a blindness born of privilege. But what Alexander couldn't control was the creeping emptiness that followed him everywhere. His success, once thrilling, now felt hollow. Every victory tasted like sand. His investors adored him, his employees feared him, and his family barely recognized the man behind the name. He had traded humanity for perfection, and perfection had left him cold. And yet life has a way of humbling even the proudest souls. Lately, the cracks in Alexander's perfect world had started to show. A new competitor was threatening his company's dominance. Whispers of internal sabotage filled the air, and his security team had quietly raised concerns about anonymous threats. But Alexander brushed them off. He didn't believe in weakness, especially not his own. To him, danger was for other people. That morning, the same morning, Marcus arrived early, humming to himself as he polished the glass walls of the lobby. Alexander was already in his office, packing, distracted by a call from an investor demanding answers. His mind was consumed with profit margins and quarterly projections, not with the strange black car idling just outside the entrance. He didn't notice the way the engine kept running or the unfamiliar face behind the wheel. As the hours ticked on, Alexander's frustration grew. He slammed his phone on the desk, muttering under his breath. From the 42nd floor, the city looked calm, but storms were brewing in places he couldn't see. Down below, Marcus would soon notice something that no one else did, something that would shatter Alexander's illusion of control and change his life forever. Because destiny doesn't care how high you've climbed, it only cares how hard you fall. And for Alexander Grant, that fall was coming faster than he could imagine. It began like any other morning, calm, predictable, unremarkable. The city was alive with its usual rhythm. Honking cars, the scent of fresh coffee drifting from street vendors, the rush of people chasing time. At Grant Industries, the building gleamed under the rising sun, its mirrored glass reflecting the world's illusion of order and perfection. Marcus Reed had clocked in early, as he always did. The hallways were quiet, the kind of silence only broken by the faint squeak of his mop and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He liked the mornings best, before the noise, before the executives arrived with their clipped voices and heavy colognes. As Marcus worked near the lobby, he noticed something strange, a black luxury sedan parked just beyond the front doors. It wasn't one of the usual cars he saw. The engine was still running, and the driver, a man wearing dark sunglasses and a cap pulled low, never looked up. Marcus's instincts, that quiet inner voice honed from years of hardship and awareness, began to whisper. Something about that car didn't feel right. He tried to shake it off, continuing his work, but his eyes kept drifting toward the entrance. Through the glass doors, he saw the driver glance at his watch twice, tap his fingers on the steering wheel, and shift his gaze toward the elevators. Marcus frowned. It wasn't paranoia. It was something deeper, the same gut feeling that had saved him years ago when a construction beam had snapped right above his head. Minutes later, the familiar sound of polished shoes echoed through the lobby. Ethan Grant, Alexander's teenage son, stepped out of the elevator, laughing while scrolling through his phone. He was waiting for his father's car to take him to school. The black sedan outside beeped twice, as if signaling him. Ethan barely looked up. He assumed it was his father's driver, as always. Marcus's heart thudded. His eyes widened as he noticed a subtle but crucial detail. The car's license plate was off by one letter from Alexander's usual vehicle. To anyone else, it was meaningless, but Marcus had an uncanny memory for details. He had cleaned that car dozens of times before, polishing its chrome and memorizing its tag. This wasn't the same car. In that instant, his instincts roared. Without thinking, Marcus dropped the mop and sprinted forward, his voice echoing across the lobby. "Don't get in that car." The shout was raw, thunderous. It cut through the morning calm like a blade. Ethan froze mid-step, startled, his hand hovering above the car handle. The driver inside twitched, a sudden movement, nervous, almost panicked. For a heartbeat, everything went silent. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then, a flash. The explosion tore through the air with a deafening roar. The car erupted in flames, shattering glass, throwing debris in every direction. The blast wave knocked Ethan backward, straight into Marcus's arms. Smoke filled the entrance, alarms screamed, and the air turned thick with dust and chaos. People ran, shouting, scattering in terror. Marcus, coughing and bleeding from a shard of glass that grazed his arm, shielded Ethan with his own body. His first thought wasn't fear, it was relief. The boy was alive. He pulled Ethan to safety behind a marble pillar as burning fragments rained down like fire from the sky. Upstairs, Alexander Grant was in the middle of a meeting when the blast shook the entire building. The floor trembled, lights flickered, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt genuine fear. He rushed to the window, staring in disbelief at the inferno below, the mangled remains of what should have been his car. His stomach dropped when he saw the familiar figure of his son, covered in soot, clinging to the janitor who had saved him. In that moment, everything stopped. The billionaire who once believed he could control every detail of life realized that all his power, all his wealth, had meant nothing in the face of fate, and that the man he'd never noticed was the only reason his son was still breathing. The sirens wailed in the distance, echoing through the city streets, but Alexander couldn't hear them. He stood frozen, hand trembling against the glass, staring at the image below, Marcus Reed, the janitor, holding his son like his own. And for the first time in a very long time, Alexander Grant felt small smoke, sirens, screams. For a few moments, time didn't exist, only chaos. The air outside Grant Industries was filled with fire and panic, a thick black cloud twisting into the morning sky. The once pristine corporate plaza was now a war zone of shattered glass and twisted metal. Marcus Reed, trembling but alert, crouched over Ethan Grant, shielding the boy from falling debris. His ears rang from the blast, but his instincts kept him moving. Years of hardship had taught him one thing: when disaster strikes, you don't freeze, you act. "Stay down," Marcus shouted, his voice hoarse. Ethan was crying, shaking uncontrollably, his school jacket scorched on one sleeve. Marcus pulled him tighter, glancing toward the flaming wreck that used to be a car. The flames roared louder, pieces of the vehicle hissing as they melted into the pavement. The driver, whoever he had been, was gone. It was a miracle anyone nearby was still alive. Inside the building, alarms blared as sprinklers activated, dousing the lobby in cold mist. Employees ran in every direction, some barefoot, others screaming names of coworkers they couldn't find. Marcus's uniform was torn, his face smeared with soot, but he didn't care. He was focused only on getting Ethan out safely. He lifted the boy to his feet and guided him toward the far exit, away from the fire. Outside, a crowd was already forming, security, bystanders, news reporters drawn by the sound of the explosion. Phones were raised, cameras flashing. The world was watching, but Marcus didn't notice. He was too busy keeping Ethan conscious, wiping soot from his face, murmuring calm words that barely reached his own ears. Moments later, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb. The back door flew open, and Alexander Grant stumbled out, breathless, eyes wide with horror. He had left the building mid-meeting, ignoring every protest from his team. Now, as he sprinted toward the scene, his world felt like it was collapsing in slow motion. His son, his only child, stood trembling in the arms of a man he barely knew. "Ethan," he shouted, voice cracking for the first time in years. The boy turned, and Alexander ran to him, pulling him into a desperate embrace. Tears mixed with soot on Ethan's face as he clung to his father. The billionaire held his son tightly, overcome by a wave of gratitude and guilt he couldn't explain. Then his eyes met Marcus's. For a moment, the noise around them faded, just two men staring at each other across the wreckage. One powerful, the other overlooked, one born into privilege, the other shaped by struggle. And yet, in that instant, it was clear who had truly stood taller. You saved him," Alexander said quietly, almost disbelieving. His voice trembled, breaking the armor of pride that had defined him for decades. Marcus didn't answer right away. He was still catching his breath, still processing the chaos. When he finally spoke, his words were simple but heavy. "I just did what anyone should have done, sir." But Alexander knew that wasn't true. He had seen the video clips already spreading online, the janitor's shout, the explosion, the dive to protect his son. The world had seen it too. Within minutes, Marcus's name was being whispered across social media, the janitor who saved a billionaire's son. Paramedics arrived, rushing Ethan onto a stretcher for examination. They insisted Marcus be checked as well, but he waved them off until he was sure the boy was okay. His hands shook, but his mind was calm. He had done what needed to be done. Yet deep down, something told him this wasn't over. As the flames were finally subdued and the last of the smoke began to clear, police cordoned off the area. Investigators whispered among themselves, noting how the car had been tampered with, how the explosion was no accident. Alexander overheard them and froze. His security chief approached with grim eyes and murmured, "Sir, the car was meant for you." The words hit harder than the blast itself. Alexander's knees nearly gave out. He looked at the charred remains of the vehicle, his usual car, and realized that if not for a scheduling mix-up, he would have been the one in that seat. His entire life, every dollar, every plan, every illusion of control, had almost ended in fire. And the man who saved his son's life was the same man he'd walked past for years without a glance. As firefighters rolled away hoses and the street began to quiet, reporters shouted questions, flashing cameras, demanding interviews. Marcus avoided them, slipping away quietly toward the service entrance. He didn't want glory or attention. He just wanted to go home, call his daughter, and let her know he was okay. But fate wasn't done with Marcus Reed yet, because what had happened wasn't just a tragedy. It was the beginning of a truth buried deep within Grant Industries, one that would soon bring both men face to face with the past neither of them could escape. The explosion had faded, but its echo lived on, in headlines, in whispers, and in the sleepless eyes of everyone who'd witnessed it. The media called it the miracle at Grant Tower. The footage of Marcus Reed's warning shout played on every screen across the nation. Commentators praised his bravery, journalists hunted for interviews, and strangers flooded his doorstep with flowers and thank-you notes. Yet Marcus wanted none of it. He returned to work as if nothing had changed, quietly mopping the same floors where smoke stains still clung to the walls. But change had already begun, unseen. Behind closed doors, the police investigation revealed a chilling truth. The bomb wasn't random. It was an assassination attempt, meticulously planned. The target was Ethan Grant. It was Alexander Grant himself. Someone inside the corporation had leaked details of his schedule, and investigators suspected an inside job. When the bomb squad examined the wreckage, they found a tiny manufacturing stamp on the detonator, a stamp from an industrial supplier that had gone out of business 8 years earlier. That detail caught Marcus's attention immediately. He had seen that mark before. Later that evening, when detectives came to question him again, Marcus asked to see a photo of the device. His brow furrowed as memories stirred. Years ago, he had worked in maintenance at a plant that produced those same components. A plant that had been shut down after a fatal equipment malfunction, a malfunction that had been blamed on him. Marcus remembered the humiliation, security escorting him out, his name smeared, his reputation destroyed. He had pleaded that the real cause was poor safety wiring, ignored by management to save costs, but no one believed a maintenance worker. The company was later bought out by Grant Industries. As he sat alone in his dim apartment that night, Marcus felt the truth wash over him like cold water. The explosion wasn't just fate, it was a circle completing itself. The empire that had ruined his life had almost destroyed its own master. And the irony wasn't lost on him. The same hands that had once been blamed for failure had now saved the billionaire who'd inherited that company's sins. Meanwhile, Alexander Grant was unraveling. He hadn't slept in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flash, heard the shout, and remembered the face of the man who'd saved his son. Guilt gnawed at him, not just for ignoring Marcus all those years, but for something deeper. In a late-night meeting with his security team, he demanded a full background report on Marcus Reed. When the file arrived, Alexander stared at it for hours, reading every line. The record was clean, too clean. Then he found it, an old case file from the subsidiary company, the one that had collapsed before he bought it. A maintenance supervisor named Marcus Reed had been fired after a machinery fire killed 2 workers. The file included Marcus's handwritten statement, a report warning of faulty wiring weeks before the accident. Alexander's chest tightened. The signature at the bottom was identical to the one on the employee ID that now hung on the janitor's belt. He realized, with sickening clarity, that the man he'd dismissed as invisible had once been the scapegoat for another man's greed that had built his fortune. The next morning, Alexander drove himself to the apartment address listed on Marcus's record. When Marcus opened the door, still wearing his uniform, surprise flickered in his tired eyes. The billionaire stood on the threshold, unshaven, holding the faded file folder in one hand. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander said quietly, "I read what they did to you." Marcus's jaw tightened. "That was a long time ago." "It shouldn't have been forgotten," Alexander replied. His voice carried no arrogance now, only regret. "You were right, about the wiring, about everything." Marcus looked at him, uncertain. "And what difference does that make now?" Alexander hesitated, glancing down at the folder, then back at Marcus. "Maybe none to the world," he said, "but it means everything to me." Silence settled between them, heavy, honest, human. In that silence, both men understood the cruel symmetry of fate. One had built his empire on other people's mistakes. The other had survived by cleaning the flaws beneath it. And yet, through tragedy, their stories had finally collided, not as master and worker, but as 2 men standing on the same fragile ground. When Alexander left that night, the city lights glimmered off his car window like distant stars. He knew the truth would haunt him, but he also knew it was the first step toward redemption. Marcus watched from his doorway, the folder still in his hands, realizing that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried forever. Sometimes it rises, demanding to be seen, just like the people the world forgets. And this truth, this buried connection between them, was only the beginning of what was about to unfold. The city awoke to a storm, not one of thunder or rain, but of headlines, flashing lights, and a hunger for scandal. The story of Marcus Reed, the janitor who saved a billionaire's son, had captured every news cycle. But now new details were emerging, fragments of truth that shook Grant Industries to its core. Investigative journalists dug deeper, uncovering the old manufacturing scandal, the wrongful termination, and the company's quiet cover-up years before. It didn't take long before the pieces fit together. The man who'd once been blamed for negligence was the same man who had saved the company's future heir. Public outrage was immediate. Social media erupted with hashtags "Justice for Marcus," "The Janitor Who Saved," and "Grant Exposed." Commentators debated ethics, privilege, and the cruelty of corporate power. News anchors replayed the explosion footage side by side with images of Marcus pushing a mop years earlier, calling it the greatest act of humility modern America has seen. Suddenly, the world that had once ignored him couldn't stop talking about him. Meanwhile, inside Grant Industries, chaos reigned. Board members demanded answers. Stock prices plunged overnight. Whispers spread through the upper floors like wildfire, whispers of greed, exploitation, and hypocrisy. Employees who had once treated Marcus like background noise now spoke his name with reverence and shame. Some even left flowers and notes at the janitorial closet door. Thank you for reminding us what courage looks like. Alexander Grant, usually calm under pressure, felt the weight of everything closing in. The empire he had built on pride and control was collapsing beneath its own lies. Reporters camped outside his mansion, cameras flashing whenever his car pulled up. His PR team begged him to release a statement, to spin the story before it ruined him entirely. But Alexander refused to speak, not yet. For the first time in his career, he didn't want to control the narrative. He wanted to face the truth. Late one night, he stood by his office window, looking down at the city that had once bowed to him. His reflection stared back, tired, haunted, human. His son, Ethan, had been quieter lately, his eyes softer when he looked at Marcus during visits. It was Ethan who had said the words that pierced Alexander's chest. "Dad, he saved me, but I think he saved you too." Those words replayed in Alexander's mind as he watched the rain streak the glass. He realized how blind he'd been, how arrogance had turned him into the very kind of man he once promised he'd never become. He had spent his life chasing numbers and status, yet the man who had nothing had taught him what real worth meant. The next morning, Alexander made a decision that stunned everyone. He called an emergency press conference. Cameras filled the room, journalists buzzing, expecting another carefully crafted corporate statement. But when Alexander stepped up to the podium, there was no suit jacket, no polished smile, just a weary man with truth in his eyes. "I built this company believing success made me powerful," he began, voice steady but heavy. "But I was wrong. True power belongs to those who choose integrity over comfort. Years ago, this company failed a man named Marcus Reed, a man I failed to see. He was blamed for something he didn't do, and instead of fighting for justice, this institution buried the truth. That man saved my son's life, and he reminded me what humanity looks like." The crowd fell silent, cameras clicked, some reporters stopped typing, simply listening. "I cannot erase the past," Alexander continued, "but I can make it right. Effective immediately, I'm reopening the investigation into that case, compensating the families affected, and personally apologizing to Marcus Reed for every wrong this company inflicted on him. From this day forward, Grant Industries will stand for fairness, not just profit." The statement hit the world like a tremor. Critics called it damage control, others called it redemption. But for Marcus, who watched the broadcast from his apartment, it didn't feel like either. It felt like truth, long overdue, but real. Still, fame had changed his life in ways he never wanted. Paparazzi followed him home, strangers asked for selfies. And news crews parked near his building hopping for a quote. Marcus, humble as ever, refused interviews. "I'm no hero," he told anyone who asked. "I just did what was right." But deep inside, he knew the world had shifted, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. His act had sparked something larger than himself, a reckoning between those who held power and those who held integrity. And though Alexander Grant's world was unraveling, something new, something honest, was beginning to take root. Because sometimes it takes one man's fall for another's truth to rise. A week had passed since Alexander Grant's press conference, but its echo still rippled through every hallway of Grant Industries and every corner of the city. The world had witnessed a billionaire kneel before truth, but for Alexander, the hardest part was yet to come. It wasn't the public humiliation or the financial fallout that haunted him. It was the quiet knowledge that he had to face the man whose dignity he'd once destroyed. Marcus Reed never expected a phone call from the CEO himself. When his old flip phone buzzed that Friday afternoon, he almost didn't answer. But something in him, maybe the same instinct that had made him shout, "Don't get in that car," told him he should. Mr. Reed, Alexander's voice came through, low and unsteady. I know I don't deserve a minute of your time, but I'd like to meet. Not for the cameras, just you and me. There was a long silence. Marcus could have said no. He could have hung up and gone on with his life, content with knowing that the truth had finally surfaced. But Marcus had lived long enough to know that healing doesn't happen through bitterness, it happens through courage. All right, he said simply. Tomorrow, the park by the old clock tower, noon. The next day, the two men stood face to face for the first time since that fateful morning. The winter air carried the faint scent of rain, and fallen leaves crunched beneath their shoes. Marcus wore his usual work jacket, worn, faded, honest. Alexander, stripped of his usual armor of confidence, looked smaller somehow, more human. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander took a breath and said, I've spent the last week trying to find the right words to say to you, Marcus, but there aren't any words strong enough to fix what I did. Marcus looked at him, his expression calm but unreadable. You don't owe me words, Mr. Grant. You owe the truth, and I heard it. That's more than I ever thought I'd get. Alexander nodded, his throat tightening. I wronged you. I let my company destroy your name to protect mine, and you still saved my son's life. I don't understand how you could do that. Marcus smiled faintly, eyes soft with something between grace and weariness. Because wrong doesn't cancel outright. Your boy was in danger, and I was there. That's all that mattered. For the first time in years, Alexander's eyes filled with tears. He had stood before investors, politicians, and global audiences without blinking, but in front of this humble janitor, his defenses fell apart. You have every reason to hate me, he whispered. Marcus shook his head. Hate's heavy. I've carried enough weight in my life. I forgave you a long time ago, you just didn't know it. The words broke something open inside Alexander. He reached into his coat pocket and handed Marcus a sealed envelope. This is for you, he said. Inside was a formal reinstatement of Marcus's position, a public apology printed on company letterhead, and a personal check, not as charity, but as compensation for years of lost wages and damages. Marcus stared at it for a moment, then slowly pushed it back. I don't want your money, Mr. Grant. I want something better. Alexander blinked. What could I possibly give you that money, car? Marcus smiled gently. Change, real change. You've got power, resources, a platform, use them. Hire people who have been thrown away like I was. Give folks a second chance. For the first time in a long while, Alexander felt something pure flicker in his chest, purpose, untainted by ego. He nodded, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Then that's what I'll do. The two men stood in silence, watching a flock of birds rise into the grey sky. For a moment, time felt still, two lives, once divided by pride and pain, finally aligned by understanding. As they parted ways, Marcus called out, Mr. Grant. Alexander turned. Take care of that boy. He's got your fire, but he's also got your heart. Don't let him forget where it came from. Alexander smiled through the tears. I won't. That evening, the city seemed quieter. The news stations were still buzzing, but for both men, the noise didn't matter anymore. Marcus went home, turned off the television, and sat beside his daughter, telling her that maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to change. And Alexander, sitting on his balcony overlooking the city lights, felt something he hadn't in years, peace. Not because his fortune was intact, but because his soul finally was. Months passed, and the world slowly shifted from outrage to admiration. The story of Marcus Reed and Alexander Grant was no longer just a viral headline. It had become a symbol of transformation, a reminder that redemption wasn't found in wealth or titles, but in the courage to change. Inside Grant Industries, everything looked different. The once sterile marble floors now carried the buzz of humanity, new hires from diverse backgrounds, mentorship programs for underprivileged youth, and an entire department dedicated to social responsibility. At the entrance of the building, a bronze plaque had been mounted beside the revolving doors. It read, "In honor of Marcus Reed, whose integrity reminded us what true leadership means." Marcus hadn't wanted it, of course. When Alexander told him about the plaque, he laughed and said, You could have used that money to fix the elevators instead. But deep down, he understood what it meant, not just for him, but for everyone who'd ever been invisible. For the first time in years, Marcus walked the halls of Grant Industries not as a janitor, but as a consultant and mentor for the company's new initiative, the Second Step program, aimed at giving employment opportunities to people wrongfully terminated, formerly incarcerated, or overlooked by society. His old mop closet had been converted into a small office, modest, but filled with warmth. A photo of his daughter smiled from the desk, beside a small potted plant she'd given him with a note that said, "You finally got a window, Dad." Meanwhile, Alexander worked quietly behind the scenes, no longer craving attention or applause. He'd stepped down from his CEO role, handing leadership to a new generation, people who believed in Marcus's message. He still came into the office sometimes, not to command, but to listen. He'd walk through the same lobby he once stormed across, nodding respectfully to every employee he used to overlook. His relationship with his son, Ethan, had also begun to heal. The boy who once hid behind screens now joined him in volunteering at local community centers. Together, they visited schools, sharing their story, not as billionaire and heir, but as two men who'd learned the value of humility through the courage of another. One afternoon, months after their meeting in the park, Marcus and Alexander found themselves standing side by side at a charity event hosted by the company. The hall was filled with laughter, the hum of conversation, and the hopeful chatter of people whose lives had been touched by the Second Step program. Marcus glanced at Alexander and said, "You did good, Mr. Grant." Alexander smiled, "No, Marcus, we did good." They clinked glasses of lemonade, Marcus's favorite, and shared a quiet chuckle. Around them, the world they'd both helped rebuild pulsed with new energy. For every person who'd been silenced, there was now a voice. For every door once closed, there was now a key. Later that evening, Marcus stepped outside, watching the sunset paint the skyline in gold. His reflection shimmered in the glass of the building, the same glass he had once spent years cleaning. But this time, he didn't see a janitor staring back. He saw a man who had stood his ground, shouted when it mattered, and changed lives by being himself. And for Alexander, watching from the window above, the sight of Marcus standing proudly outside filled him with something he hadn't felt since his youth: hope. The kind that wasn't bought, built, or branded, the kind that came from being human. Their stories had intertwined like two rivers that met after years of running parallel, different in origin, but one in purpose. Marcus had taught Alexander that success without compassion was failure, and Alexander had taught Marcus that even the most powerful men could change if they were brave enough to face themselves. As night fell, Marcus began walking home, passing through the familiar streets of his old neighborhood. Kids playing basketball waved at him, shouting, "Hey, Mr. Reed, we saw you on TV." He smiled and waved back. In that moment, he realized his legacy wasn't in plaques or programs. It was in every young person who'd learned that doing the right thing, no matter who you are, can change everything. Sometimes heroes don't wear suits or capes. Sometimes they wear work boots, carry mops, and speak up when everyone else stays silent. And sometimes the world listens. And so, the story of Marcus Reed, the humble janitor who shouted, "Don't get in that car," and changed the fate of a billionaire, came full circle. What began as an ordinary morning turned into an extraordinary moment of courage, compassion, and redemption, a reminder that sometimes the smallest voices can echo the loudest truths. In a world that often values wealth over worth, Marcus's act stood as a quiet rebellion, proof that integrity isn't measured by what you have, but by what you're willing to stand for. He had no fortune, no fame, no power, and yet his instincts, rooted in kindness, saved lives and awakened a conscience that had long been asleep. Alexander Grant, once blinded by pride and privilege, learned that true leadership isn't about control, it's about accountability. When his empire began to crumble, it wasn't his money that rebuilt it, it was humility. By listening to the man he once overlooked, he discovered the kind of strength that can't be bought, the strength to admit when you're wrong, to grow, and to begin again. Their story reminds us that life has a way of testing who we are when no one's watching. Marcus could have stayed silent that morning. He could have looked away. But courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite it. And in that single moment, he changed not only a life, but a legacy. Sometimes the people society underestimates the most carry the wisdom we all need. The janitor, the nurse, the bus driver, the street vendor, they are the pulse of humanity. They remind us that kindness still matters, that integrity still wins, and that every act of goodness, no matter how small, can ripple farther than we'll ever know. So as you finish this story tonight, ask yourself, thought balloon, what would you do if your moment came? Would you speak up when silence feels safer? Would you choose what's right, even when it costs you? Because heroes don't wait for recognition, they rise when it matters most. Marcus Reed never sought attention. He didn't act for cameras or applause. He acted because it was the right thing to do. And that's the kind of strength the world needs more of, the kind that comes from heart, not headlines. At Swift Tale, we tell stories like this to remind you that humanity is still out there, in every act of kindness, every second chance, every voice that refuses to stay silent. Sparkles, so if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you believe in goodness again, don't forget to show your love. Backhand index pointing right, like this video. Backhand index pointing right, share it with someone who needs hope. Backhand index pointing right, and subscribe to Swift Tale for more real, powerful stories that touch the heart. Speech balloon, and before you go, tell us in the comments, what did this story teach you about courage, forgiveness, or second chances? Your words might inspire someone else who's struggling to believe that change is possible. Because in the end, one act of courage can rewrite destiny. Just like it did for a janitor named Marcus Reed and a billionaire who finally learned to see. Thank you for watching, thank you for believing, and remember, every story matters, especially yours.